Yes, Mr. Hill.
So we are turning now to two presentations on pool sizes used in fractionation, firstly in England and Wales, and then in Scotland. All of the qualifications that usually apply to presentations given by counsel to the inquiry apply to these as well. I won't repeat those here. The focus is going to be on factor 8 in terms of the pool sizes. We have some data for factor 9, but it is much less satisfactory, unfortunately. I'll start with the England and Wales presentation. There is a written presentation that goes alongside this, and similarly for the Scottish presentation as well. It may be that people find it easier to read the written presentation than to reflect back on the transcript today, because there are a lot of figures which are going to be given, and I'm afraid it might be quite hard to follow at points, but we'll do our best. In England and Wales, the focus of the presentation is on BPL. There are various sources that we will look at. I'm afraid it's the same story of different data sets, different figures, some correlation, more correlation perhaps here than in other cases. But there is, I'm afraid, a little bit of leaping from one set of material to another. I will go through what those sources show in terms of figures and present that in tables and in some graphs. And then we will go back and look at some of the underlying documents to see what they can tell us about the reasons behind the increases and about the processes involved, although, as a spoiler warning, there is only a limited amount of material that the inquiry legal team has been able to discover on that. I'm also conscious that you will hear evidence in the coming days from Dr. Snape, covering England and Wales, and Drs. Perry and Foster, covering Scotland. And as ever, we do not seek to preempt that evidence. They may be able to shed some more light on this. Before turning to what is covered in the presentation, there is, as ever, a prehistory to the growth of plasma pools in the 1970s. We don't have a great deal of evidence about plasma pool sizes in the 60s and 70s at the moment, but more work can be done on that area in due course. What we do have are little fragments which may help to set the scene before we pick up the story again in the mid-70s, from where we have much more data, not least because that is the area that the HIV litigation focused on. If we could go first, please, Sully, to HCDO 40581, page 1, please. This is an article that has been introduced before at the inquiry, and I'm certainly not going to go through it in any detail. It is an article from the British Journal of Haematology in 1974, volume 26, page 313, by Dr. Rosemary Biggs, entitled Jaundice and Antibodies Directed Against Factor 8 and 9 in Patients Treated for Haemophilia or Christmas Disease in the United Kingdom. As I say, I'm not going to go into the substance of that article. What I am going to take you to at page 6, please, Sully, is a table that Dr. Biggs gives us, which shows the material given to haemophiliac patients treated in Oxford from 1969 to 1971, to quote the words that she used in the article. We can see 3 years are given, 1969, 1970, and 1971. The table includes information about the number of patients treated and then gives figures for the different types of material that those patients were treated with: plasma, cryoprecipitate, and factor 8 concentrate. If we look at the last of those for each of the years, factor 8 concentrate, in the final column, we can see the mean pool size given in terms of the number of donations that went into the pool. For 1969, that mean pool size is 160 donations. In 1970, it is 192 donations. And in 1971, it is again 192 donations. That is from the PFS BPL in Oxford, we can see from the preceding column that for those years, the number of pools fractionated were 83 in 1969, 72 in 1970, and 80 in 1971. In the presentation, the general way of translating donations into the size of a pool, or vice versa, is to adopt an assumption that at this time, about 180 millilitres of plasma was given per donation. Some sources have it a little higher, some have it a little lower, but we have adopted 180 millilitres. Using that figure, the pool sizes would be about 30 litres to 35 litres expressed as volume rather than donations, according to this table. When comparing this to the later figures I'm going to give you, it is important to emphasise that these come from the PFL in Oxford and not BPL, which is where the later figures come from. Second, as Dr. Lane put it, this was at the cottage industry stage of plasma fractionation. Later, we are going to move on to the factory stage or the industrial stage, where far more factor concentrates are being produced. But that is a figure that we have for 1969 to 1971 in Oxford. The next document I'm going to take you to in terms of prehistory is Cbla 40253. This is a memorandum from Dr. Bidwell of the PFL to Dr. Maycock, then director of BPL, dated the 22nd of January 1975. It is entitled Number of Donations in a Batch of Factor 9, and I'm going to come back to this document when we are talking about Factor 9 specifically. But for now, I'm just going to take you to the first sentence. Dr. Bidwell wrote, and I quote, "When we talked about labels at Elstree in November, we agreed to have printed on the label for Factor 8 that it was derived from, quotes, not more than 500 donations, end quotes, and that we would cease putting on the precise number of donors whose plasma had gone to make up the pool." That is where I will stop for now. What this appears to be saying is that before this discussion in November 1974, the label on a bottle of BPL Factor 8 would have the exact number of the amount of donors whose plasma had gone into that bottle. The agreement that was reached in November 1974 was that instead of doing that, the label would carry the words, quotes, not more than 500 donations. We will come on and look at some labels shortly.
So it might mean, well, it obviously means less, but that the 500 donations or less, it could be 500 donors at most, but it may be less if, for instance, the donors are given more than one donation.
Again, in the presentation, we have assumed that one donation equals one donor. We're on safer ground doing that in England and Wales, and indeed in Scotland, than we are with commercial concentrates, because plasmapheresis isn't generally being used. So a donor will be giving at most 2 donations a year, so it's unlikely they will end up in the same pool. The exception is for plasmapheresis donors, but they are a relatively small number in the UK at this time. If we could take that down, please, Sully. The third document I will take you to is BPLL 303721. This is a memorandum from Dr. Maycock to Dr. Bidwell from the 8th of December 1975, so approximately 11 months later than the one that we have just looked at, and it is not in reply to the previous memorandum, but it does refer to donor pool numbers. Dr. Maycock wrote, "Thank you for your memorandum of 3rd of December 1975. As we increase preparation of factor 8 concentrate, we propose to increase the size of pool as far as labelling is concerned in 2 steps during 1976 and 1977. Present, 150 litres, 830 donations. 1976, 270 litres, 1,500 donations. 1977, 360 litres, 2,000 donations. Numbers of donations are based upon 180 millilitres of plasma per donation. The large pool size can be defended on the ground that starting plasma and concentrate are tested by RIA. I think PF Lab and BPL should keep in step. Therefore, I would like you to introduce steps of 1,500 and 2,000 donations in the size of plasma pools for factor 9 concentrate. I think the number of donations should be shown on the factor 9 label as well as on the factor 8 label. We'll come back again to the question of factor 9. For present purposes, what I draw your attention to is this. Firstly, that as of the 3rd of December 1975, the present pool, as expressed at least in terms of labelling, was 830 donations, being a plasma pool of about 150 litres. And you will see that Dr. Maycock uses that 180 millilitres figure as the way of translating from donations to litres. You will also see that there is a plan to increase the size of a pool from 150 litres to 360 litres between December 1975 and 1977. And that will be an increase from 830 donations to 2,000 donations. I have brought you to that document because that is the first one that appears in the tables in the written presentation that I'm going to show you shortly. But as we can see from the documents that precede it, there has already been a growth in pool size by that time.
Well, we've moved from Biggs's 160 average number of donations in a pool through to 180, to Cbla, 200 not more than 500 donations, to 830, 1,500, 2,000.
Yes. We have switched centre at that time as well from Oxford to BPL, but yes. It's no longer the cottage industry we're looking at; it's the production facility. Yes, yes. It's also relevant to note that in this memorandum, Dr. Maycock says, "I think PF Lab and BPL should keep in step." Yes. Now, the qualification to that is that the memorandum as a whole is talking about labelling, but whether or not that translates to actual donation size is not wholly clear. But he does say, I would like you to introduce steps of 1,500 and 2,000 donations in the size of plasma pools for factor 9 concentrate. I'm going to turn now to the 2 sets of contemporaneous documents that we have that help to set out the maximum limits on pool sizes in the 1970s and the 1980s at BPL. These are primary sources in the sense that they come from the time that they are describing. It is important to note that they are about the maximum limits, and in terms of labels that are placed on bottles and correspondence about what the maximum limit could be, it doesn't necessarily follow that the maximum was being used at the time, but we will see in due course we have some other data on that. which correlates relatively closely. The first set of documents that we're going to look at are some BPL product labels from the 1970s and the 1980s. I note that I'm not going to be going to product labels from Scotland because Ms. Richards is going to be looking at those in due course with witnesses, so I won't preempt that. If we could turn, please, Sully, to Cbla 309269. This is a label from a BPL Factor 8 bottle, which is dated, according to the date at the bottom of the document, March 1976. We don't have any reason to doubt that date, even though the label itself is not filled in. If we look at the left-hand side, we can see that it says, the label says, prepared by Blood Products Laboratory, Lister Institute, Elstree, Hearts. So that is BPL. The label is entitled Human Antihemophilic Fraction. And we can see the bottle contents are said to contain factor 8. And there is a gap left for saying how many international units are contained in the bottle. There are instructions about how to reconstitute the concentrate. And then on the right-hand side, we can see on the label less than 1,500 plasma donations used in the production of this batch. We're having a little difficulty spinning it round, but I hope people can see that on the right-hand side of the label, written bottom to top, as it were. Thank you, Sally.
Oh, there we are.
So 1,500 donations. That's it. Thank you. Or less than 1,500 donations, 1,500 plasma donations used in the production of this batch. That is March 1976. If we could now go, Sully, please, to BPLL 0001692_008. If we could go to the second of those labels, please. This is a label, if we could just pull out for a second, Sully. Thank you. This is a label that comes from a bottle that was fractionated, according to the sheet, on the 11th of September 1980, and the factor 8 assay date is the 3rd of October 1980. So we're in the autumn of 1980. If we can now please expand it, Sully. We can see again that this has been prepared by BPL in Elstree. It is said to contain factor 8 and 250 international units. It is an intermediate purity product. If we look on the left-hand side, first of all, we can see that less than 5,000 plasma donations Thank you. Less than 5,000 plasma donations were used in the preparation of this batch. And if we could turn it back around, Sully, to its original orientation and expand the central part of the label. This label contains the warning, the preparation is of human origin and cannot be assumed to be free of hepatitis virus. That is a warning that was not on the previous label from 1976. Thank you, Sully. The next label we will look at comes from the 7th of January 1983. It is BPLL 001692_009. Sorry, BPL 301692_009. Apologies, Sonny. The top label is, if we could just pull out a little, please, Sully. We can see a date, let's say, at the top, date effective 7th of January 1983. And then if we could zoom in on the label, please. Again, the warning is there. The preparation is of human origin and cannot be assumed to be free of hepatitis virus. We can see that the batch number is HL, and then the batch number is given. HL is the intermediate purity product that was produced by BPL. And on the left-hand side, we have the words less than 7,500 plasma donations were used in the production of this batch.
I think that may be so small you can hardly see it, but it's...
I have read it on the computer. I'm confident it's...
No, I can read it, but I'm just thinking about those who are watching it at a distance,
yes,
or maybe on a home screen. So I think they can be assured that it's there. If they need further assurance, they can go into the actual document itself, those who are participants and can do so, into the relativity, or catch it online.
All of these figures are set out at paragraph 12 of the written presentation. I'm going to bring up that table in a second. The references to the underlying documents are there as well, so they can be checked in that way. I'm now going to go to a document which contains...
Can we just go back to that page, the original page?
BPLL 301692_009.
Thank you. Just looking to see if there's, because the second label is about a year later, isn't it?
The second label is March 85 and concerns 8Y. There's a document which helpfully sets out a number of different labels, including labels for 8Y, and gives dates for them.
And this one does actually have a figure in it. If you look underneath dried factor 8 fraction, and look at the wording underneath that, underneath the warning. The preparation is of human origin, less than 10,000 plasma donations used per batch.
Yes.
So, albeit that it's 8Y, it's heat treated, we have moved from less than 7,500 in January 83 to 10,000 or less. Less than 10,000 in 1985.
Yes, that's right. We can see that helpfully on the document BPLL 302039. We have 3 labels set out, and before we go to any of them, you can see on the right-hand side added to those labels, written next to them by whoever has prepared this document, other words, pre-June 1985, June 1985 to February 1987, and February 1987 onward. Now, we don't know who put those dates there. We can't say that we have found evidence that absolutely confirms those dates, but we can say that we haven't found evidence which disproves those dates given. The first one, pre-June 1985, if we could expand that, please, Sully. This is stated to be for an intermediate purity product with no heat treatment, and that fits with what is on the label and fits with those labels that we have just seen. On the left-hand side, a little bit more clearly this time, you can see that it says less than 7,500 plasma donations were used in the preparation of this batch. So that is in keeping with what we have just been looking at. The warning there, the preparation is of human origin and cannot be assumed to be free of hepatitis virus, is also consistent with the labels that we have just seen. If we could go to the second of those labels, please. This is stated to be from June 1985 to February 1987. It is for a high purity HT3 product, which is 8Y. We can confirm that it's 8Y because in the bottom right-hand corner of that label, you can see the code 8Y1. As with the label that you just went to, sir, it says, warning, this preparation is of human origin, brackets, less than 10,000 plasma donations used per batch. It has been subjected to heat treatment in the vial to reduce the risk of infection by viral agents, including hepatitis and AIDS viruses, but cannot be assumed to be free from risk of infection. If we could then expand and go to the final of these three labels, stated to be from February 1987 onward, and for FHC1, I'd say I'm not entirely sure what FHC1 stands for there. It is also stated to be barcoded, and we can indeed see a barcode of the bottom right-hand corner. And it's also stated that there is no donation limit. And that is confirmed by looking at the section on the warning, which now reads, and I quote, "The preparation is of human origin. It has been heat-treated in the vial to reduce the risk of infection by viral agents, including hepatitis and AIDS viruses, but it cannot be assumed to be free of the risk of transmission of viral infections." So the same warning as the previous label, but with the reference to the product being derived from less than 10,000 donations removed. It is stated to be a dried factor 8 fraction, high purity, heat treated. If we could just go to one further document which helps to bear out what I have said about the fact that we can't establish from our own research that those dates are correct, but the material that we have seen is consistent with them. To make that point, could we go to BPLL 0016009_161? If we could look at the top left-hand corner, there is a date given for date effective, which is the 15th of February 1988. The batch number is FHC. The label below, which is stated to be a sample label, is headed dried factor 8 fraction, high purity, heat treated. We can see on the left-hand side that 8Y is stamped on it. A barcode in the bottom right-hand corner. And the warning is this: the preparation is of human origin. It has been heat-treated in the vial to reduce the risk of infection by viral agents, including hepatitis and AIDS viruses, but it cannot be assumed to be free from the risk of transmission of viral infections. Again, no reference to the number of donors. Thank you, Sully. If we could take that from the screen, and if we could instead put up, please, INQ 40375, the tables on page 5 and 6, please. INQY 40375. The tables on pages 5 and 6. INQY 40375. It's the presentation itself. Will you just give me a moment, sir? I have given you a Duff reference. It's INQY 40345, not 375. Sorry, my mistake. This is the written presentation. The labels that I've just taken you to, and some others, are included in this table. We can see how the maximum pool size on those labels increases from 1,500 donations in the March 1976 label up to 5,000 donations on the September 1980 label, then 7,500 donations in the January 1983 label, 10,000 donations on the March 1985 label, and then from June 1985, according to the document that we saw. And then no stated limit from February 1987 onward, according to the document that we saw, and according to our own researchers, we found that on a label from June 1988. It's important to note that we cannot say that the label changed on the 11th of September 1980, just that we have a label from that date which shows 5,000 donations, whereas the previous label we have found from 1976 has 1,500. The second source that we have from the time itself, which helps us to understand the maximum limits on BPL pool sizes, are references that are contained in correspondence, and particularly correspondence between people at BPL and people at PFL, about what the maximum pool sizes are. I'm not going to take you to the documents, but I will take you to the table, which is at the same reference, Sully, at page 7. We can see table 2 at paragraph 16 contains 4 references. The documents are given their unique IDs in the right-hand column. The information that we have obtained from those documents give maximum pool sizes of 5,000 donations in October 1980, 7,500 in January 1982, 10,000 in June 1985, and then 25,000 in June 1986. We will come back and look at that document a little later. That correlates closely with the labels that we have looked at, the additional piece of information coming from the June 1986 data suggesting 25,000 donations at a time when there was no limit stated on the labels on the bottles themselves. We also have some secondary sources which help us to check and to test the information that we have received from our primary sources. The first is a series of estimates about pool size given by Dr. Terry Snape during the course of the HIV haemophilia litigation. Dr. Snape is going to be coming to give evidence next week, so this may be something that we pick up with him then. But for now, I will show you the table that is in the written presentation at paragraph 27, which records Dr. Snape's estimates. These were given in response to a request from Dr. Lane for information on the pool sizes used to manufacture factor 8 BPL from 1975 onwards. If we could go, please, to page 11. We could expand that table, table 3, please. Dr. Snape's estimates are that in 1975, the approximate weight of the plasma pool used at BPL was 150 kilograms, and that came from around 750 donations.
That is assuming, of course, that each of the donations produces what? How many? It's 20, 200, isn't it?
I think it is.
Because on the assumption that 5 times 200 milliliters equals 1 litre, 1 litre is therefore 1 kilogram, assuming that that's the equation, which is, I think, the equation that's broadly in line with the figures. 150, that is 150 times that, so it's on the assumption of 200 per, which is rather higher than the assumption which you've used.
It's also worth noting that later on, if we look down, for example, at February 1988, and the batch is FHC, 2,400 kilograms, 10,000 donations. The assumption there is 240 millilitres.
Yes.
Which may well reflect the growing use of SAG-M, the additive, which allowed for more plasma to be taken from a single donation.
Yes, it's between 86 and 88. It goes up from 200 to a higher figure.
Yes, that's right.
240, as is obvious from the figures there.
We have been using a different figure, 180 millilitres. And it's not to say that we are right and Dr. Snape is wrong, but just that we have used those different figures.
Yes.
Something that we recognise in the written presentation is that the figure of 180 millilitres, which we have stuck with all the way through for consistency, becomes less reliable as we move through the mid-80s into the late 80s because of the increased use of SAG-M. There aren't that many conversions that we do in the written presentation from that time, but it is something to keep firmly in mind.
I suppose also there may be developments in the amount of factor 8 activity that you can extract, in other words, the yield.
Yes. Yes.
Both going down possibly with the start of heat treatment, but then up again with the different processes.
Yes.
Yes.
We can come back and we can ask Dr. Snape more about the assumptions that he made and how he drew this data. For now, we simply include it as a further data source for this presentation. And it is one, I should say, that does correlate relatively closely to other data sources, save towards the end of this period. The weight of the donor pools approximated increases from 150 kilograms in 1975 to 450 kilograms in 1977, which Dr. Snape equates to an increase from 750 donors to 2,250.
Yes.
Then up to 600 kilograms in August 1980. The number of donors there is 3,000. March 1981, it increases to 900 kilograms. The number of donations, 4,500. July 1982, the approximate weight is up to 1,200 kilograms. Number of donations is 6,000. The same figures are given for April 1985. I pause there to note that the figures from September 77, August 1980, March 81, July 82, and April 85 are all given by reference to specific batches of HL, the intermediate purity, non-heat treated product. So presumably, Dr. Snape has gone back to the records and checked those batches and given those figures accordingly. But he refers to the weight as an approximate weight, and obviously the donations figure is derived from the calculations that we have just been discussing. July 1985 is the next figure in the table. That is again said to come from an approximate weight of 1,200 kilograms and 6,000 donations. That is for 8Y. In November 1986, 8Y is again the batch code. The donor pool has gone up to 1,400 kilograms, or 7,000 donations by this time. The next figure is for February 1988. The weight has gone up to 2,400 kilograms, number of donations 10,000. June 1988, 3,200 kilograms, number of donations 13,500. December 1988, 3,400 kilograms, number of donations 14,500. Same figures for July 1989. So that is what we get from Dr. Snape's estimates. A further secondary source that we have, a set of documents which are entitled Batch Histories. If we could go, please, Sully, to Cbla 2014475. And if we could, sorry, if we just stay on this page for a second, we can see that this is a document that is prepared during the HIV haemophilia litigation. As with other such documents, we don't have a final document because the litigation was settled. So these kind of working papers weren't finalised, but they do provide us with some information from those who had been working on the case as of 1989 and 1990, putting the documents that they had to hand in order. If we could go to page 168, please. These are the batch histories that we have. It is really a list of batch numbers, the year issued, and then a column saying number of donors, and then columns about whether or not the product has been heat treated, whether it has been tested for HIV or the pool has been tested for HIV. The column stating number of donors is not explained further, so we don't know whether they are basing this on a precise figure or on a maximum label or what the basis of the number of donors is. But, thank you, Sally, if we could take that off. Having looked at the batch history, we have produced a table which is at page 12 and just going over into page 13 of a written presentation. We could have that, please, INQY 40345. Thank you, Sully. Something to note here is that the batch history sometimes shows changes in donation numbers, but it doesn't give a specific date for when VAT changes occurred. In order to be able to present this in tabular form, we have used January and July of a given year to reflect a change during that year. But that does not mean that the change came in July 1980. It's just our way of showing that during the year it changed. And the table is set out this way so that it can feed into a later graph. We can see that the approximate number of donations, according to the batch history figures, were 2,250 in 1978 and 1979. That figure went into 1980, but during 1980, it increased to 3,000 donations. That figure again went into 1981, but during 1981, it increased to 4,500 donations. That is also the figure that we have for 1982, at the start of 1982, sorry, but during that year, it increased to 6,000 donations. From 1983 to 1985, and even going into 1986, that figure of 6,000 donations remains constant. But at some point in 1986, the approximate number of donations increases to 7,000. That is also the figure given going into 1987. That is where the batch histories table stops. So an increase from 2,250 in 1978 to 1979 to 7,000 at some point in 1986. Of note there, so I pointed out here, it's reflected in some of the other data as well, but it's perhaps easy to point it out on this table. That period between some point in 1982 and some point in 1986 sees a plateauing of approximately 6,000 donations per batch after a period of increase before and preceding a period of increase afterwards. The final table that I will take you to, which is from paragraph 43 of the written presentation, is a table that is drawn from contemporary reports that we have from BPL. These are, when I say reports, these are reports that are given in letters, in memoranda, in minutes, and indeed in more formal reports as well, and publications. If we could go, please, to page 16 of the same reference. The table goes over into page 17 as well, please, Sally. These are figures that we have extracted from various pieces of information that we have got from the relevant periods. There are a series of caveats that go with them, which are set out from paragraph 36 of a written presentation. We have discussed those as we've been going along, so they are about the size of the translation between volume and donation numbers and weight and donation numbers and weight and volume, and the one donor to one donation ratio that has been used. It bears repeating that the figures that are contained in this table are therefore approximations. They show a trend, but they cannot always be relied upon to be precise at that particular moment. The first entry is the one that we looked at at the start of this presentation, which is the 830 donations that Dr. Maycock said was the present figure on the 8th of December 1975. The next entry from the 11th of January 1978, I'm not going to take you to the underlying documents. The next entry is 2,000 plus donations, 11th of January 1978. The 18th of January 1978, the figure is 3,000 donations. Then other figures from 1978 are given by reference to volume, 400 litres, which translates at 2,200 donations if one takes 180 millilitres as the measure. 1979 and 1980, we can see an increase up to 600 kilograms, about 3,330 donations. We understand that to be linked to the stopgap programme, and I will come back to that shortly. 1980, 5,000 donations for the 1st of September. A different figure at 3rd of September 1980, 3,500 donations. Now, this is not to say that pools were necessarily fluctuating at this time. It may be that we just have these little snapshots of data which may refer to the maximum possible size, whereas the 3,500 donations refers to an individual pool that was fractionated at that level. A figure for March 1981 is 2,504 donations, but April 1981, 5,000 donations. February 1982, more than 3,000 donations. April 1985, 1,200 kilograms, which equates to about 6,660 donations. Later, in March 1985, 7,200 donations. In June 1988, so a significant gap there, 3 years, a 2,000 litre pool, which would be a little over 11,000 donations. And then April 1990, so again another gap of 2 years, 25,000 donations said to go into a plasma pool. April 1991, 20,000 donors, and 17th of May 1991, 13,000 donations. So these are little snapshots from different times. And again, I stress they're helpful to show a trend, and one shouldn't delight on a single figure and say that is what the pool size was for the entirety of that year. Two graphs help to show this situation. First, same reference, Sully, page 18, please. The same caveat applies as I gave a few days ago, that data points on this graph are joined by a straight line, but it shouldn't be assumed that there has been linear growth between those two data points. In fact, often you will see a step up when a pool size is increased. There are 3 lines shown on this graph. The one in purple is drawn from Dr. Snape's estimates that we looked at earlier. The one in green is drawn from the batch history that we looked at earlier. And the one in blue is drawn from the contemporary records table, which is the table that we have just looked at. The point that I take from these figures is that they correlate fairly closely up to January 1985. There is then less data in the later 80s, but again, there seems to be a correlation of a growth in pool size and a steep growth after about 1986, 1987, so at the time of the redevelopment of BPL. And then the contemporary records go much higher because they go later into the 90s, whereas the other data stops in the 1980s. And so that graph illustrates that the tables that we have been looking at tell broadly the same story. Then if we could turn over, please, to page 19.
Yes, I mean, if you
Sorry.
if you tried to just envisage a line of best fit between those various data sources, it might look pretty much like a straight upward line without any great increase in its rising up. So it's not a bell-shaped curve, or not the sort of curve we've been used to seeing in respect of coronavirus.
No, that's right. Until 1986, 1987, 1988, at the point where the new BPL opens. And granted that we have far fewer data points after that, there does seem to be a sharp increase.
At that stage?
Yes. Another point to note about this graph is that in order to capture that late surge in pool size, if that's what it was, it's been necessary to extend the vertical axis up to 25,000 donations. So inevitably, if one does that, then the rises in donor size at the start of a period look more modest than they would look if the vertical axis was had a smaller figure in it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
If we could go over, please, to page 19. The same three lines are shown on this graph. And this is just to compare them to the data that we have about maximum limits of pool sizes from the product labels and from the correspondence. The product labels are shown by the yellow line, and the correspondence is shown by the red line. I think it is fair to say from that graph that the maximum limits are higher than the data points that we have from the other sources, Dr. Snape's estimates, the batch history and the contemporary records, with a couple of exceptions which are very close to the line and may just be quirks of the way that the data has been put together. So it would appear from that graph that while the donation size of while the pool size has grown in the period, it has not exceeded the maximum pool sizes given either on the labels which accompany the product or in the correspondence with it. Thank you, Sully. That can be taken down now. That was for factor 8. As I say, the factor 9 data is, I'm afraid, much less satisfactory. If we could go to INQ 40345, page 20, please. Sorry, I've given you the wrong reference again. Sorry, Sally. INQY 40345. This is paragraph 52 in the table that is shown there. The best that we're able to do with the information that we have about the size of factor 9 pools at BPL from 1983 to 1987, we can see that the figures there contain the smallest batch, the largest batch, and the mode figure, which is the figure that appears most often. That is, we think, the better measure than an average figure at the time, given the data source that we've got. These are taken from the batch history documents that were compiled as part of the HIV litigation. As you will see, it's far less extensive than factor 8 data. 1983 to 1985, the smallest batch, the largest batch, and the mode are all 6,000 donations. In 1986, we see that the smallest batch and the mode are 6,000 donations, so the most common pool size in 1986 from the data that we have was 6,000 donations. But the largest batch was 24,000 donations. Now, that may be explained by the fact that in 1986, your standard production was 6,000 donations, but there were experiments run or a batch run at 24,000 donations. Then in 1987, the smallest batch is 8,000 donations. The largest batch is 20,000 donations. And the mode, so the most common batch, is 18,000 donations. If we could then please, Sully, go to page 22 of the same document. This is a table that is drawn from the contemporary reports that we have for BPL factor 9, so the same approach that we took to factor 8. Unfortunately, it's difficult sometimes to discern whether the references in the documents are specifically to factor 9 or whether there is an assumption that what applies to factor 8 will also apply to factor 9. And that may not have been a safe assumption for the reasons that we'll come on to in a second. But we can see there that the figure obtained for January 1978 is over 2,000 donations. Then a second figure for a week later of 3,000 donations. July 1978, 400 litres, approximately 2,200 donations. April 1981, 5,000 donations. December 1984, 1,200 kilograms or 6,600 donations. June 1988, 2,000 litres or a little over 11,000 donations. April 1990, 25,000 donations. April 1991, about 20,000 donors, which we equate to 20,000 donations. Those are the figures that we have. If we look at page 23, please, Sully. We can see a graph again showing a similar rise to that which we've seen for factor 8. But I would like to take you to the document that we looked at earlier, sir, because it does raise a question that we will perhaps come back to in evidence in due course. And it is Cbla 40253, please, sir. This is the minute from Dr. Bidwell to Dr. Maycock, dated the 22nd of January 1975. We looked at the first sentence earlier, which was about the conversation they had had about labels at Elstree, and it was agreed that they would now say not more than 500 donations. What Dr. Bidwell goes on to say is this, and I quote, "Mr. Snape has pointed out to me that the batches of factor 9 prepared from the Elstree material correspond to much higher than 500 donations, and that the exact number is not known to us. If we pool the smaller batches here, we know the number, but again, it is more than 500. I've told Mr. Snape to have printed on the new labels not more than 1,000 donations, but the whole subject of having anything at all on the labels seems difficult. It is certainly not much of a guide to the clinicians any longer. Can we discuss this, please?" Now, frustratingly, we don't have a document setting out Dr. Maycock's reply, and it may be that there never was such a document. The discussion may have been an oral one. I'm conscious that Mr. Snape, or Dr. Snape as he now is going to come and give evidence, so I won't speculate about what this means. But I will raise one possibility, which is that there is evidence to suggest that factor 9 was sometimes fractionated from factor 8 pools which had been used to produce factor 8 and then were repooled in order to make factor 9. And if that is right, then it may be that there is potentially a larger donor pool which went into a factor 9 product than a factor 8 product. But as I say, Dr. Snape is giving evidence next week, and we may return to that in due course. Those are the figures then that we have for BPL. I'm going to go to a couple of documents now which may shed some light on why the pool size has increased and the processes involved. If we could start with Cbla 40149, please, Sully. If we expand the top half, please. This is a memorandum which is entitled Notes on an Outline Scheme for Preparation of Factor 8 Concentrate from 1,000 litres of plasma per week. This document doesn't have a date, but from the context of it, we know that it was before March 1974. I take that from paragraph 5 of the note, which I'm not going to take you to, but refers to a timetable being achieved by March 1974, so we know that this document preceded March 1974. What it says is that, and I quote, "This scheme is intended to use, as far as possible, existing facilities in the lab. 1. Pool sizes 250 litres 4 per week. 250 litres would equate to about 1,375 donors. If we look about just below where the handwriting is, we can see these words: the present working capacity of the large plant for 1,500 litres of plasma weekly includes 200 litres of supernatant from fresh plasma. Now, it's hard to piece together what is contained in this document, but what it appears to be is a proposal to move from fractionating plasma in pools of unknown quantity, but amounting to 200 litres per week, possibly one pool at 200 litres per week, but we don't know that. Possibly that 200 litres could have been split into different pools. But what is proposed is a pool size, a new pool size of 250 litres. And as I say, that's about 1,375 donors. The suggestion is to do that 4 times per week. And that will increase the amount of product that is produced at BPL. There are then technical discussions about what will be needed in order to achieve this. Then, Sally, if we could go, please, to BPLL 303721. This is Dr. Maycock's memorandum of the 8th of December 1975, which we went to earlier. I highlighted earlier that the present pool size was given as 830 donations, 150 litres, and the plan was to increase that pool size. If we could go down, please, Sully. To 270 litres and then 360 litres. And then Dr. Maycock said, and I quote, "The large pool size can be defended on the ground that starting plasma and concentrates are tested by RIA, that's radio immune assay, that is for test for hepatitis B surface antigen. So that is the defence to adopt the word used by Dr. Maycock that is being put forward for expanding the pool at that time. Another memorandum from Dr. Maycock, which I won't ask to be brought up on screen, but is referred to at paragraph 63B of the written report, comes from the 19th of March 1976, where Dr. Maycock agreed to the pool size of PFL factor 9 being increased to 500 litres. And he said that he was agreeing this, quote, on the understanding that the final pool is prepared from 2 or 3 sub-pools, each of which has passed its safety tests, including RIA test for the presence of HBsAg. So again, a reference to the fact that testing is being linked to the increase in pool size. I note from that memorandum that there is a reference to the factor 9 being prepared from 2 or 3 sub-pools, which may be that process that I was mentioning earlier, that once factor 8 has been fractionated from the supernatant, the pools are then mixed to allow for factor 9 fractionation. In the same month, March 1976, and as we heard in a previous presentation, BPL made an application for a product license for factor 8 from Elstree. And that product license said that the maximum pool size foreseen at Elstree is 450 litres. 2,500 donations are the figures that were given in the product license application. I note the word foreseen there rather than the word being or words being used or the present size. The application also stated this, and I quote, because of the large number of control tests which have to be made, there is a trend towards larger pools in order to lessen the amount of testing and reduced waste of valuable material. The reference is given at paragraph 64 of a written presentation. Moving forward to 1977 and 1978, we get to the period of the stopgap programme that we discussed before. And at that size, and as we heard, part of the stopgap programme involved increasing the size of the plasma pools fractionated at BPL from 400 litres to 600 litres. That is approximately 2,200 donations to 3,300 donations. And that increase may shed light on something that we discussed before. Sully, if we could have, please, INQY 40337, page 39. This is from Appendix 2 to the chronological presentation for England and Wales, and it's this confusing point that we discussed before about why it is that in the fourth column there, the capacity of BPL expressed in the amount of plasma that in theory could be fractionated is given as increasing between 1977 and 1979, whereas the capacity as expressed in the amount of product that could be provided, expressed in terms of international units, remains constant. Now, I don't claim to have an answer, but one possibility is that this increase in pool size helps to increase for figures between 1978 and 1979, and that is perhaps not reflected in conversations that were taking place about what the output was in terms of international units at the time, which is why we have a figure for 15 million there. I still can't resolve it, but I do note that the increase in pool size at this time may have played its role in helping to increase the capacity of fractionation as expressed in the weight of plasma that is fractionated. While we are on this document, sir, it was pointed out to me by some of the core participants whose mental arithmetic is far superior to mine, that if you add the figure for 1977, 67,200 kilograms, to the figure for 1978, 57,600 kilograms, you get the figure.
You do, yes.
I can see you nodding along. Again, your mental arithmetic was far better. They raised this because, as was pointed out, it is a very odd coincidence if it is indeed a coincidence. We agreed, and so we have gone back and looked at the underlying documents to see whether or not this is just a function of somebody adding 1977 to 1978 and coming up with a figure for 1979. We don't think that that is what happened. Having gone back to the original documents, the 1977 figure is based on a number given by Mr. Watt of the SNBTS in a meeting on the 11th of March 1977. I won't take you to the reference, but for the record, it is SCGV 601_172. The 1978 figure is taken from a handwritten memorandum to Dr. Lane, dated the 28th of February 1978. The reference is Cbla 40738. And the 1979 figure is derived from a document prepared by Norman Pettit of BPL, dated the 27th of February 1979. And the reference to that is Cbla 40916. So 3 independent sources from at least 2, possibly 3 different authors written at different times. So we are as satisfied as we can be that the fact that the 1979 figure is the sum of the 1977 and the 1978 figures is a coincidence rather than indicating anything more substantive. It is, however, a very strange coincidence, and we're grateful for it being brought to our attention.
It's curious if it was additional, that the international units actually produced at the far right-hand side aren't additive.
It is a period of unsatisfactory data.
Yes.
If we put it that way, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for why these figures behave in the way that they do. The wider picture is that the stopgap program does allow an expansion of production, and it is taking place during this time, and therefore it might not be a step change but a gradual change, which is reflected in some of these figures but not in others.
Yeah.
Going back then to pool sizes, Ms. Richards, when presenting the work on Dr. Lane, took you to 2 documents that I won't take you back to, in which Dr. Lane explained in September 1980 that he was content to expand the pool sizes at Dr. Smith's request up to 900 kilograms on some days, as Dr. Smith put it. Dr. Lane said that he was prepared to do this as, and I quote, "I'm sure that once one has exceeded 100 to 200 kilograms pool size, one has already exceeded any possibility of small pool protection. I've discussed this with John Crask, and he agrees exactly on this point." A document you saw yesterday, I won't go back to it, but 100 to 200 kilograms pool size quoted by Dr. Lane would approximate to about 550 to 1,100 donations. Moving on to January 1982, again, I won't take you to this document, but it is at paragraph 76 of a written presentation. Dr. Smith wrote to Dr. Lane requesting permission to increase the pool size from, requesting permission to increase the pool size to the equivalent of 1,200 kilograms or 7,500 donations, and he gave reasons for it, including making the most effective use of the freeze-drying plant and helping to test new processes in preparation for the expansion of BPL. Those are all set out of paragraph 76 of the written presentation. We then have that period where pool sizes appear to remain broadly constant from about 1982-83 to about 1985. And then three documents to finish with that we may come back to with Dr. Snape. The first is Cbla 302190. This is a memo from Dr. Snape to Mr. Prince, copying Dr. Smith and Dr. Lane, dated the 10th of June 1985. It is entitled Coagulation Factor Batch Sizes. Dr. Snape wrote this, quotes, "Further to your memo of the 25th of April 1985, I have assumed that a limit of 10,000 donations maximum will not restrict operations in the present building, but that an extension to 20,000 donations maximum will be required for the new facility. The higher figure will be used in any product license applications." So it appears to be gearing up for the redeveloped BPL. If we could then go, please, to Cbla 304791. This is from June 1986, so a year later, again from Dr. Snape to Mr. Prince and Dr. Smith, copied to Dr. Lane and others, entitled Pool Size Limitations for Heat-Treated Concentrates. Important to stress that the concentrates are, by this stage, heat-treated. Dr. Snape wrote this, and I quote, "Dr. Lane has agreed that the maximum pool size may be extended to 25,000 donations for heat-treated coagulation factor concentrates. The appropriate label revisions will be made as soon as possible. Please check that any manufacturing document is revised before the increased limit is implemented." On the same day, Dr. Snape wrote to Dr. Smithies at the DHSS, and this is at DHSC 302303_027. DHSC 302303_027. Dr. Smithies was the successor to Dr. Walford as Principal Medical Officer in the DHSS, the relevant division of the DHSS. The document is dated the 20th of June 1986. It is entitled Maximum Donor Pool Size for Coagulation Factor Concentrates. And what Dr. Snape writes is this: "I am writing to advise you of a proposed change in donor pool size limitation for BPL and PFL coagulation factor concentrates. It is proposed to increase the maximum number of donations to be pooled from 10,000 to 25,000 plasma donations. In taking this decision, we were mindful of the terminal heat treatment of coagulation factor concentrates made from such pools, and the fact that any increase beyond the already large 10,000 donor limit is probably not significant. I thought you should be aware of this proposal. And that is from Dr. Snape. We will pick that up with him in due course. The terms of the memorandum, you may feel, sir, are significant as to who was taking that decision and who was being informed of it. That is where I will leave the BPL presentation. We'll turn now to Scotland, which I'm happy to say is a more straightforward story. Again, there is a written presentation that has been provided on relativity and on the internet. The reference is INQY 40346. Mr. Buchra, over the last couple of days, has taken you through developments in Scotland, and I won't repeat that. There is a shift from the use of cryoprecipitate to the use of factor concentrates, and a concentration of the production of blood products at the PFC in Liverton, as opposed to occasional alternative suggestions of having fractionation sites locally. I won't take you to any of the documents there. There was a hope expressed at a meeting of SMBTS directors and haemophilia directors on the 8th of May 1975 that cryoprecipitate should be completely replaced by concentrates, and it was suggested that cryoprecipitate could be, and I quote, obsolete in 5 years. The reference is paragraph 6 of a written presentation. That was 1975. That did not come to pass, but factor concentrates did increase in use, as you have heard. The figure from 1976 to 1982 is an increase in PFC factor rate from about 1.3 million international units to 4.75 million international units. There was a corresponding decrease in cryoprecipitate from 1.27 million international units in 1976 to 682,000 international units in 1982. That increase in the use of factor concentrates seems to have had an effect on the pool sizes used at PFC. And it appears that the pool sizes were in part determined by a desire to reach the level of production that self-sufficiency in blood products required in Scotland. If we could go, please, to SBTS 40309_023. This is a letter dated the 16th of March 1973, so very early on in this part of the story. It is a letter to Dr. MacDonald of the Scottish Home and Health Department from Mr. Watt, Scientific Director of the SMBTS. At paragraph 1, we can see that Dr. Watt wrote this. At present, we are between products in that one is being phased down whilst the other is being raised. As discussed yesterday, we are embarking on preparation of a high purity fraction, which we might, for convenience, call Super 8. The planned production capacity for this product is one pool of 200 litres per week. This was deliberately chosen to meet a projected need to process 50,000 donations of plasma per annum to meet Scottish needs for this product. We do not expect to reach this rate before mid-May, and capability beyond that date would be dependent on plasma supply, completion of clinical acceptance trials, clinical demand, etc. So that is from March 1973. There are also documents set out of paragraph 14 of the written presentation that indicate that pool sizes at PFC also increased because of a sense that it was advantageous in terms of yield and reduction of loss to fractionate in a larger pool size. I won't take you to that document, but it is, as I say, set out at paragraph 14. As demand rose for factor concentrates going into the 1980s, there was an exploration by Dr. Foster and others of ways of increasing supply from the PFC. In a memorandum dated the 29th of December 1980, again, I won't take you to it, but it is at paragraph 15 of a written presentation, Dr. Foster explored the limiting factors on production at PFC at that time. He concluded that the key limiting factor, both on the pool size and the frequency of processing, was the freeze-drying capability at PFC. 2 freeze dryers were available for use. One was limited to a freeze-drying a plasma pool of 300 kilograms. The other was limited to freeze-drying a plasma pool of 500 kilograms. In that memorandum, Dr. Foster suggests that one way of increasing production would be to increase the plasma pools by using smaller vials, which means that you could fit more into the larger freezer, and that would allow for a pool size of 700 kilograms. The significance of this is borne out by Dr. Perry's written statement to this inquiry, in which he said, and I quote, that PFC pool sizes, quotes, were designed and established to be aligned with anticipated process yields and the maximum capacity of freeze dryers used for the final stage of processing. At the time in question, PFC had 2 production scale freeze dryers of different capacities for this purpose. That is paragraph 16 of the written presentation. Dr. Perry and Dr. Foster are both coming to give evidence, so I won't go into this any further, save to say that the data that we are about to look at seems to bear out the fact that pool sizes at PFC in the early 1980s and were conditioned to an extent by the fact that the plasma from the pool had to fit into one dryer or the other. Now, we have some data about the pool sizes at PFC at this time. If we could go, please, to SBTS 40238_009. This is a review report from April 1984 from Dr. Foster and Ida Dixon of PFC, looking at a Factor 8 recovery at PFC from April 1980 to September 1983. So it's not a report about pool sizes, but it does touch upon pool sizes. If we go to page 8, please. This is a table that was compiled as part of that report, which refers to Factor 8 batches that were still in process and question mark pending rework. What I take that to mean is that these are batches that have not been dispatched from PFC for various reasons. You can see the reason for holding in the right-hand column. What this helpfully shows is the size of the plasma pool for each of these batches. We can see in the top row a batch from 1978 to 1979 had a plasma pool of 114 litres. 3 batches of air from 1979 to 1980, they are stated to be 167 litres, 175 litres and 300 litres. 1981 to 1982, we can see a number of batches. There are 3 that are 255, 260, and 2 that are 260 and 290 litres. One is expressed as 255 vials, and we're not quite sure if a vial equates to a litre. But you have 2 at 290 and 260 litres, and then the other 3 are 450, 479, and 535 litres. So it would appear that you have those 2 freezers, one of which can cope with up to about 290 litres, possibly up to 300 litres of plasma, the other of which can cope with up to, on these figures, 535 litres. And it is a similar story for 1982 to 1983, that you have a split between 7 batches, 3 are just under 300 litres, and 4 are between 495 and 555 litres. If we could just go over the page as well, please, Sully. We have another table setting out further batches that failed quality assurance tests. And we can see the size of those batches. And again, similar story from 1980 to 81 and 1981 to 82, where you have some batches which hover between 250 and 300 litres, and other batches which are about 500, in this case 540 and 555 litres for 1983 to 1984. Now that information correlates with other sources that the inquiry has. These are set out at paragraph 19 of the written presentation. I don't think there's a need to go to the underlying documents, but we can see at paragraph 19 that in a letter from November 1990, Professor Cash said that pool sizes for factor 8 at PFC were between 200 and 300 kilograms between 1978 and 1980. Dr. Perry, in his written statement to the inquiry, says that the pool sizes increased during the early 1980s and varied between 300 and 550 kilograms. And then Dr. Perry's evidence is consistent with another report that we have for the period 1981 to June 1983 from the SNBTS Factor 8 study group, which recorded pool sizes of either 320 or 550 kilograms. If we could please put on screen, Sully, INQY 40346. And page 9, the table at the top of that page. This is taken from the written presentation, and it draws together that information that we have just gone through. It is important to state that the table is comprised of limited data points, and it is possible there are other data points and other pool sizes that were used at the time, particularly in the early 1970s. We have used, in the final column, the same measure of donations per litre, so 5.5 donations per litre, as we have used for England and Wales, although Dr. Perry, in his statement, estimated that there were about 4 or 5 donations per litre, so there is a degree of reasonable difference, depending on which translation one takes. But looking at that, we can see that from the data, the estimated donations for the pool size of 114 litres in 1978 to 1989 is 627. That is just one data point that we have from that year. 1979 to 1980, we have a range of between 167 to 300 litres. That is a range of donors from about 900 to about 1,650. 1980 to 81, the pool size in litres is 144 to 290 litres. The range in donors, 792 to 1,595. That 792 is a precise figure given, but of course it is an approximation. 1981 to 1982, the plasma pool size in litres ranges from 260 to 540 litres. The estimated donations, 1,430 to 2,970. 1982 to 3, 283 litres to 555 litres, or 1,557 donors to 3,053 donors. And that figure of 3,053 donors is also used for the single data point for 1983 to 84. We have only limited data for pool sizes thereafter. One interesting point of data is, I think we could have this on screen, please, Sully. It's PRSC 40965. This is a memorandum from Dr. Perry to all staff, subject line AIDS, date 31st of January 1985. So this is just after the discovery of the Edinburgh cohort that Mr. Buchra referred to, and which you've heard evidence about before, the 16 people who were infected with HIV through the use of PFC products. Dr. Perry, in the third paragraph down, refers to the fact that all of the donors who contributed to this pool of factor 8 had been identified or have sought to be identified. And he states that there were 4,000 such donors. So it appears that Dr. Perry's conclusion is that the suspected pool was made up of 4,000 donors or donations. It is not entirely clear which metric is being referred to, but perhaps in this instance it doesn't matter. But that is a little higher than the figures that we have looked at in the table which took us up to 1983 and 1984. You have heard from Mr. Buchra the steps that were taken in response to HIV and AIDS. They notably did not include steps to restrict the donor pool size at that time. There is a reference at paragraph 23 to a memorandum sent from Professor Cash to Dr. Perry on the 7th of December 1984, in which he gave his view that any moves to restricting donor pools should be discussed by all directors. He said, and I quote, "It's an exciting option, but I suspect will have colossal cost and operational implications. There is much to be done before we need consider this option." The final piece of data that we have is an article from 1985 written by Dr. Foster and Alan Dixon of PFC. And that recorded, I needn't take you to it, that at the time of writing, the pool sizes for continuous thawing were between 600 kilograms and 1,000 kilograms. Adopting the 5.5 donations per kilogram conversion figure, that equates to 3,300 to 5,500 donations. That is from 1985. The reference is at paragraph 24 of the written presentation. There is a graph, sir, at page 12 of the written presentation, so that is INQY 40346. I think perhaps we could try page 13. Page 11. Found it in the end. If we could expand that, please, at the bottom. The same caveats apply to this graph as to previous ones about the lines between the data points. There are two lines which show the lowest range and the highest range of the pool sizes at PFC. There is also a dotted line that shows the average pool size at PFC, but I'd suggest that perhaps isn't as useful because it does seem to be that the plasma pools are either one size or another depending on which of the freeze dryers was being used. But we can see that both of the lines do show an increase in the early 80s, and then a further increase between 1984 and 1985. But I stress that the start and the end dates are based on very limited data points, and so obviously come with a degree of caution as a result. That is all I intend to say at this stage about pool sizes at PFC as well. And you will, of course, be hearing further evidence in the coming days from Dr. Foster about production at PFC, among other matters. That's all I have for you today.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hill. So tomorrow we have
Dr. Foster.
Dr. Foster, don't we?
Yes.
10 o'clock. 10 o'clock tomorrow.